Thank you, gentlemen. So my talk is about American history, which is unnerving given the audience. I know a lot of you guys have a much deeper knowledge of American history than I do. So you just have to hang with me. It's a very idiosyncratic view that I'm presenting. Another way of saying that is I have a very warped view of American history. It'll be three phases. I'll be watching your eyes to see who's going to sleep. And as soon as I start seeing drowsiness, we'll take a break, regroup, slam beers, return full of vigor. The three phases are the entire history of the United States, which that should be easy to put into a 3-hour segment. But beginning with before the founding of the country and the colonization process, going up to 1900, then the 20th century, and then concluding looking at where we're at in the 21st and where we go from here, at least according to my warped view of the story that led us to this point. So I want to start talking about the Puritans and the plantation culture. Maybe you're familiar with the author Paul Johnson, the late Paul Johnson. His book, A History of the American People, had a real deep impact on me when I was young. It was the first American history book that I'd ever read in full. And I read it side by side with Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, the kind of socialist, to say the least, view, versus Paul Johnson's, which is very celebratory, very much a defense of America and its history. It was due to that book, actually, that I felt I became an American. I read it in preparation for a trip to Europe in 2007, and when I met Europeans, I realized I was a proud American. The minute someone started griping at me about American politics and American policy, I, in my redneck fashion, corrected the record, telling them to eat shit, you fucking frog. So the real importance, I think, of Paul Johnson's view is he brings out the diversity of American thought from its inception up into our present day. And the three strands that I want to concentrate on at first are slavery, purity, as in Puritans, and liberty. You can't talk about American history without talking about slavery, nor can you talk about American history without talking about liberty. And that polarity is going to be very important because there is no monolithic American thought, as you know. Really, there's no monolithic thought in any nation, but America has a very eccentric history of thought with all sorts of bizarre cults emerging, all sorts of wild ideas that become popular in other parts of the world. So those polarities between religion and science, the polarities between purity and liberty, the polarities between the individualism, and collectivism, of course, the spectrum from nature to technology. And as you know, America began as a diverse continent with the Native Americans, and then the introduction of the various European peoples from the Spanish to the French to the English, and accumulates more and more novelty going forward. A lot of people look at phases of history and they think of it as a shift from one thing to the next, but I think a better way of looking at it is, yes, certain things are removed over the course of history, but that history is more an accumulation of novelty and diversity. And as you know, diversity is our strength, but what diversity is our strength? What combinations of diversity make America strong? That's the real question that I want you to ask yourselves. And beneath that is the question of tolerance. How much can you tolerate? Because if you look at the history of American thought, that liberty allowed American culture to delve into all sorts of dark corners of the human psyche and human behavior. So beginning with the slavers, I don't want to get too hung up on the individuals, but I'd be remiss not to bring some of them up. Paul Johnson opens up his book on American history really focusing on Walter Raleigh. Now, Raleigh himself wasn't a slaver, but he was very much an adventurer. He was very much a badass. He had fought in Europe. He came to America in order to really kickstart the colonization process. And the reason that Johnson focuses on Walter Raleigh is because Raleigh not only embodies the adventurous spirit of America, the conquering spirit of America, but also the irreligious spirit of America. Raleigh, like so many others who came, and especially those gathering around the slave plantations, were primarily motivated by profit, by conquest, and had very little use for religion. So irreligion was there from the beginning in the colonization process, alongside that lust for wealth and power. And of course, what the fruit of slavery really were, aside from human suffering, was that vast accumulation of wealth. And it was a wealth, especially at the beginning, that began with vices as the main staples. So tobacco, going further south, sugar, and then eventually cotton, which I don't know if you would consider cotton to be a vice, but it's a crazy thing to make people suffer and toil under. And it's an even crazier thing to go to civil war over, but that is in fact what happened. So at the beginning you have that hierarchical racial concept of the Europeans as supreme, conquering, and in essence, a people who were justified by nature's God, because nature's God would not have made them so powerful were they not intended to exert their power. And you also have that concept of race, right? This is going to be very important as we talk about this. Race, robots, and religion. Because race, bloodline, is the essence of in-group solidarity and in-group preference. Race and bloodline will determine much of the distinctions and conflicts going forward in America. And that's coupled with religion, because religion gives a sacred canopy either over one's race, as in the case of the Jews or the Hindus or many of the Chinese or the Africans, the Native Americans, all of them referred to themselves, if you translate it, as the people. That bloodline obsession is basically a perennial human trait, but it's justified by religion or it is subverted by religion in the case of Christianity, Buddhism, Taoism, so on and so forth. Now, as you know, the slaving culture was mainly in the South, and that spread out from Virginia, North Carolina, Roanoke, Jamestown. But the first recorded slaving was in 1619. You probably know the 1619 Project. To commemorate that is the founding of the United States. Whatever your opinions of that, I do think it's a very, very, very significant point in American history, because that's when you begin what I consider to be the moral crime of slavery. And you also have, a year later, the Pilgrims landing on Plymouth Rock to found New England. And the Pilgrims and their successors were what we know as the Puritans. And it's an extraordinarily important part of American culture, because I would argue that much of the American obsession with ideological purity you can trace back to the Puritans. Now, the Puritans came here to escape religious oppression. They came here for freedom. But of course, they established cultures that suppressed other belief systems. So you had John Winthrop, who in essence came from a sort of Anglican background, but a separatist. And John Winthrop, aside from being somewhat of an egalitarian in the sense that he believed that the colonies that he presided over should have a contract, a kind of social contract by which one devoted oneself to one's community, and also a sense of individualism in that one should be reading the Bible, or at least following leaders, decentralized leaders who read the Bible for themselves. So they're escaping that clerical hierarchy. They're escaping that dogmatic and systematic authoritarian way of religion to found a new form of religion, but a religion, ultimately, the legacy of the Puritans is one of intolerance, radical intolerance. You're probably familiar with the witch burnings. You're probably familiar with, was it Thomas Morton, who was punished severely for erecting a pagan maypole. And these sorts of concerns with purity, with moral purity, and with the purity of the community are offset by the true quest for liberty. Again, the Puritans were seeking liberty from the old world religious authorities. You could argue that the slavers were seeking liberty from economic destitution. But the pure libertarian, you might say, or liberty-minded ethos would express itself also very, very early. And you had the figure of Roger Williams, which I think is a fascinating character. He had a sharp critique of the slave culture. He also had critiques of the ways in which the Europeans were mistreating and screwing over the Indians. And for that, he drew the ire of authorities, and there was a plot to have him deported back to England. But he escaped largely thanks to John Winthrop, who, for the most part, didn't care for his moral crusades. And he especially didn't care for Roger Williams' focus on true religious liberty, so that the main connection between a man and God should be between a man and God with no mediator. That connection, of course, being between a man and the Bible, or a woman and the Bible. And Roger Williams escaped with his family to Rhode Island, founded the state of Rhode Island. And Rhode Island, as far as I know, it was the first state to be founded solely on the basis of religious liberty, but it may be the only state, as far as I know. I think that Brian could correct me if I'm wrong. The only state that was founded for the purpose of cultivating religious liberty. A couple of centuries later, that would bear fruit in a figure, H.P. Lovecraft, who hails from Rhode Island, and H.P. Lovecraft's concept of these voodoo cults, these colored people, these outsiders who are summoning this tentacled sort of alien god, or swarms of alien gods. It's going to be very important when we get to the conclusion of this talk. But again, I want to open up with this idea first of America as a kind of New Eden, which was a very popular mythos among the early colonial settlers, and also America as a promised land, these kind of biblical parallels that this is this divinely ordained, either from a conscious and interested God or simply nature's God, a divinely ordained conquest of a virgin land. In the beginning, it was cultural, yes, but it was largely a biological phenomenon. The colonizers coming in and basically meeting virgin lands and Indian rapists, and proceeded then to kill off the Indian rapists and rape the virgin land, denuding it of its pristine nature, its animals, so on and so forth, leaving us with what is admittedly a beautiful landscape, but one which is entirely lacking of old growth. That conquest would proceed, especially in the 20th century, to something more social, a social conquest of what you might think of as normal Americans, by way of the Cultural Revolution, by way of immigration, and also leading to the 21st century conquest of the biological by the mechanical, and especially the digital. But we'll get back to that in just a moment. Now, I want to highlight that, again, that there was, yes, the Puritans were quite intolerant. And yes, there were a number of religious organizations that would have preferred to see their religious denomination be the sole denomination in America. But there was also, there were laws before the founding of the country and the signing of the Constitution. There were laws to enforce tolerance. So you weren't allowed to call people fish heads or round heads, or the various disparaging names in regards to their religions in many of these colonies. So that tension is there. And it then becomes solidified or crystallized or enshrined in the Constitution with the First Amendment, the freedom of religion. the freedom to profess and live out one's religious life according to one's conscience without interference by a state religion. There'll be a lot of fruits of this, many of which are good, right? America, one of the, if not the most charitable nations on earth. And America, having cultivated, I think, in many ways, a society or civilization that is, in many respects, superior to the frogs and the tea-sucking island monkeys, which we escaped to get here. But that freedom did have some costs. And the eruption of strange cults, the eruption of strange beliefs are an inheritance that we have to deal with, either by laughing them off or accepting them, perhaps embracing them, or building up cultural barriers so that we ourselves don't become lunatics like, say, the Scientologists or the Mormons, all of which, by the way, I must insist, are good people, despite the fact that their worldview is perhaps not based, at least not in the reality that I occupy. So that First Amendment is very important. It enshrines the principle that Americans can believe as they want. And it opened up, basically, it was as if they established petri dishes across the nation in which various charismatic leaders and visionaries were able to conduct mimetic experiments to incite mutations, psychological mutations, cultural mutations, things that were extremely novel, extremely strange, and the legacy of which we still see today. The background of this, of course, is Christianity, mostly Protestant Christianity, over time Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, and offshoots that maybe even Protestants wouldn't consider to be normal. Again, the Mormons or perhaps the Jehovah's Witnesses. But that background didn't just spring into being. It wasn't just there. Again, from the very beginning, there was this irreligiousness or unchurched aspect to the American populace. So that at least one statistic is that a tiny minority, by 1800, a tiny minority of Americans actually went to church. 7%, 8%, 9%, something like that. Not to say they weren't religious people, but they did not belong to a church. And the Christianity, the kind of Christian America that we see today, is a result of massive pushes for proselytization, for evangelism. You had the First Great Awakening, which was mostly Calvinist, much of what we would see in, like, say, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, so on and so forth, and leading up to the founding of the country. And then the Second Great Awakening, which saw the introduction and the explosion of the more mainline Protestants that you would recognize from, say, the Southeast here, the Methodists, the Baptists, normal Christians. Christians, if you walk into their church, they're not going to try to sleep with your wife, at least not overtly, nor will they tell you that you have to cut off your genitalia, at least not right away. You have something else that's happening, though, early on in American history, and that's the development of these very, very strange sects, these strange cults. And when I was studying religion early on at the University of Tennessee, actually, in religious studies, and we talked about American religion, there was this fixation on the strange, a fixation on the novel. And it's important to keep in mind that as we talk about the Shakers, the Oneidas, the spiritualism and the seances, it's not to say they weren't prevalent, but they're still very, very small in comparison to the rest of the country. But because of their peculiarity, they had a very, very deep impact on what the culture would become. Everything from the hippie communalist movement to what we would now call transhumanism or cyborg culture, all kind of had its origins in these strange mutations, these cultural mutations, or at least it created this bed of openness and this a tolerance for weirdness. So if maybe you're familiar with the Shakers, they arrived in America with the charismatic leader Ann Lee late in 1776. So they arrived right at the founding of the country. And the Shakers came from the Quakers, and you know the Quakers, right? Kind of peculiar Protestant religious institution, very egalitarian. people sitting in a room oftentimes in total silence waiting for the inspiration. And they were called Quakers too because they had this, I don't know what it actually looked like, there's no video, but they had these kind of strange convulsions that they were at least known to do. And then there were the shaking Quakers, which were apparently even more spastic and kind of epileptic spiritual people. And the Shakers, aside from being distinct in their religious practice, had extraordinarily distinctive beliefs. So Ann Lee, really the charismatic founder of the Shakers, Ann Lee, she tragically lost 4 of her children in childbirth, which must have been very, very traumatic. But she would then become, at least in her own self-created mythology, a mother to all, a spiritual mother. Because Ann Lee, again, in the spirit of spiritual or religious freedom, believed that God was both mother and father. And she believed that Jesus was the expression of God as father, God as the male principle. But she also believed that the female principle was just as strong, and it was believed by her followers and professed, I think, by her, that she was the incarnation or the worldly expression of God's feminine side. Extraordinarily heretical. No mainline Christian would accept it, but they were able to thrive in America through industriousness, agriculture, a lot of economic advantages, but also just simply the openness of the land and the openness of the culture. So one thing that was very distinctive about, I'll give you 3 things that were very distinctive about these Shakers. The first, and it's distinctive only in that it's distinct from the main culture. There's a number of other groups that did this, but they were communal. They were communal. They shared everything in common. And secondly, they were pacifists, like their Quaker predecessors. And thirdly, they were celibate, entirely celibate. They only grew their ranks from adopting children or bringing in converts. And it's probably one of the reasons they didn't continue on and thrive, although they thrived for many, many decades, despite the fact that they weren't having children. But that sexual norm, very, very unusual. Of course, you had monastics who were celibate, but these are couples who are celibate, or men and women who were celibate, living together in these communes from the very beginning of the country. But it wouldn't be, there would be so many other kinds of cultural mutations going off in various directions. So one of the common counterpoints that people look at and focus on are the Oneidas. And just incidentally, I failed to mention that the Shakers really began in Albany, New York. And the Oneidas, they were founded in Oneida, New York. And you probably know that Joseph Smith also hailed from New York State. And the Fox sisters, seances, and then later on the Hudson Valley UFO sightings. New York State, for whatever reason, seemed to produce a significant number of cultural mutations like this. It was oftentimes called the burned over district. And the reason being is that people, it doesn't really make sense linguistically now. It made sense then that people would beat a path to New York looking for spiritual enlightenment and spiritual freedom. So the Oneidas, they, like the Shakers, were communal. They shared everything in common. And their leader, John Humphrey Noyes, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, their leader was a perfectionist, a self-proclaimed perfectionist and a utopian. And he believed that the true meaning of the Bible was to realize Christ, to realize the Christian spirit here on earth, to perfect the earth. And so he set up the Oneida community as a model for what a perfect Christian community should look like, so that it would then spread, replicate, right? This novel mutation would begin to spread from this petri dish to the next, to the next, to the next, was the intention. So they were communal, they shared everything in common. But they also had another peculiar institution that distinguishes them from the Shakers. They had open marriages. They were free lovers. And this is in the 1800s. Very, very significant. They had what were called complex marriages. And these complex marriages consisted of female elders who would arrange for what they called interviews, which means they were getting it on. And they had children that then were raised by their mother for the first year and then were raised in common, right? It takes a village to raise a child. Well, for the Oneidas, quite literally, that's how it was done. And this commune, this free-loving Christian commune, even went so far, kind of later on in their history, to begin to play with what we would now call eugenics. They believed that, like Darwin, that the significant progress in getting new types of dogs from dog breeding, keep in mind this is happening around the same time as the Victorian explosion of dog breeds, which showed without a doubt that very, very quickly through selective breeding you can create new kinds of creatures. And very, very quickly you can create new kinds of creatures not only with different physical appearances and physical capabilities, but differences in intelligence, differences in temperament. And so the Oneidas had begun to attempt this as well. They went on for a little over 3 decades before finally disbanding, but the impact of that was significant because it would go on to be a model for many of the communal cults that America is, in some circles, known for, especially come the 60s. And it's also a key sort of example of how far people will go given a bit of religious freedom. It's not to say that these sorts of things don't happen in other countries, but this was a very distinctly American sort of process of cultural mutation. Another one that's also, I think, quite interesting, the Fox sisters. If you're familiar, again, this is all in the burned over district of New York. The Fox sisters were 3 sisters who were able to magically call to spirits from the beyond, and the spirits would rap. They called it spirit rapping, right? And the spirits would rap at their command. And this was part of a much wider culture of seances and spiritualism and occultism, a desire to be able to break on through from the materialist bounds of the proto-scientific secular ideology and make contact with beings from another world. And they were also a forebear of what I would call feminist witchery, covens of bitches, in which you have these women, and solely women, who are getting attention, who are getting social status from calling to spirits from another realm, allowing themselves to be possessed, right? A very feminine sort of quality to allow oneself to be possessed of these spirits. And it was remarked upon by many of the suffragists, many of the early feminists, that these were models for later feminism, because at that time, women in general were to be seen and not heard, and yet you had these women who were calling to these wraiths, these ghouls, perhaps demons, perhaps angels, I don't know, fallen angels, and using that to have social standing, to have the ability to speak, which is, again, another mutation that, yes, it was happening in Europe, and yes, it's happened throughout history in Christianity, and even to some extent in Islam. I think about Muhammad's wife, Khadijah, or the successors in Shia coming through Aisha, but it was an American feminism, I think, does represent like a distinctly powerful cultural mutation in which no longer the boundaries and standards of patriarchy hold. And you have this opening up first to feminism and then to various other kind of sexual proclivities. And then, of course, also the racial element, which is woven into all of this. So you have these wild mutations. I'm going to just go into one more before we break, and that is the Mormons. Now, I might poke fun at the Mormons. I might poke fun at Joseph Smith. South Park did it better than I ever could, so I won't attempt to make you laugh. But Joseph Smith also represents a profound cultural mutation. So that, yes, he is coming out of the Christian tradition. And he was also a Freemason. So to some extent, that Freemasonic order must have influenced the founding of the Mormon religion. But his is a very, very peculiar story. one in which he's visited in the mid-1800s, I think it was 1830, by God and Jesus. Right there, side by side. Not unlike his counterparts in other charismatic cults. Ann Lee, for instance, the Shaker founder, also said she made direct contact with God, with Jesus, and God as woman. And so Joseph Smith claimed the same. And then, of course, he's visited by the angel, Moroni. The angel tells him that the secret history of America is buried near a tree. And he directs him, somehow he gets a hold of two jewels, the Urim and the Thummim. And he has these gold plates, which only he and his closest associates can see. And he reads them through the Urim and the Thummim from behind a curtain and dictates it in kind of King James Old English, which was already outdated by that time, which is very interesting that these ancient plates would be written in such a fashion. And it told the history of the Jews coming and creating civilizations in America, and then the civilizations go away. You could say it's a precursor to some of the modern day science fiction or historical fiction that merges with nonfiction as a genre so that people can basically make up whatever they want, and if they do it well enough, then they get tons of followers. And that is the point of Mormonism, or the point of directing attention towards Mormonism. It wasn't a flash in the pan like the Shakers or the Oneidas. It wasn't a flash in the pan like so many religious cults. Mormonism is incredibly powerful. I might get fired just for saying something bad about them. We'll see. Incredibly powerful, incredibly successful, able to cultivate families which stay together, like amazing rates of continuous marriages, very low divorce rates. Also, amazing capabilities for social cooperation, especially in regard to corporations, and also because of their their traveling evangelical culture, they're very popular with the intelligence community. So many Mormons are represented in the CIA, for instance, because of their facility with language and their exposure and access to foreign cultures. Mormons are extraordinarily powerful, but their belief system is so divergent from normal Christianity, it's kind of hard to call them Christian in any traditional sense of the term. And I'll just give you one example. I used to invite Mormons to my house all the time, and I'm not sure if they were supposed to tell me this, but they did very early on. It was Sister Shaw and Sister Bradshaw. And Sister Shaw was hot, Sister Bradshaw was not. And I kind of was sweet on Sister Shaw. And so I'd have them over, and they talk all the time, and they was asking at one point, like, okay, so this view of heaven and hell, it's now well known, but this is in the 90s. It was kind of hard to, at least for me, to get a hold of it. Like, what do you believe in heaven and hell? How does that work in Mormonism? And if you're not familiar, I'll give you a quick breakdown. If you're just kind of a pretty good Mormon, you've been saved, but you didn't get married, you didn't wear the magic underwear, you didn't do everything just right, you go to the telesmial sphere, which is kind of like low-rent heaven, It's sort of like the Super 8 of heavens. And then just above that is the telesmial sphere, which is better, right? Like Holiday Inn, basically. And then above that, if you've done everything right, you were saved, you're married, you wore the underwear, you didn't drink booze, you didn't drink caffeine, you didn't eat chocolate, you didn't jerk off, you didn't do any of these things. And you go to the celestial sphere. And the celestial sphere is the highest. And below that is, of course, and outside of this is the outer darkness, basically hell. And you can see the outer darkness from the telesmial sphere. So like you're in the Super 8 and you're looking down at the homeless people, you know that you're at least better off than them. And then the same from the where were we at again? Holiday Inn, the telesmial sphere looking down, and the celestial sphere, I don't know. I don't really stay in 5-star hotels. Somebody else have to provide the example. But you're able to see that you didn't end up like those suckers. More importantly, though, as you face forward, as you face into the future, because you have your wife, maybe you have a few wives, but definitely your main squeeze, your main woman, you are then empowered. You're given a planet of your own, and you become a god and are able to create life on a new planet all on your own, a kind of a theurgy. You're becoming divine. You're able to become a god. And this will be important also as we move into the transhuman phase of this warped telling of American history that I'm trying to provide. But so you can see the cultural mutations were plentiful. You can see that even in those that died out, the forms, the modes continued on. And among those that were the most successful, like the Mormons, tremendous amounts of power, tremendous staying power, but also social and political power. Ask anybody in Utah or Arizona how powerful Mormons are politically. Very, very. Now, sticking with the history though, I think that the Civil War also represents an important religious moment for so many different reasons. Aside from it being the culmination of a tension that had been building for centuries and also the release of tension, it became enshrined as a religious moment, right? The winners of the war, the North, believed that God had given them the duty to free the slaves. And they also, when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, they believed that he was vindicated by his moral synchronization or his moral resonance with God. And if you look at not only Lincoln's speeches in regard to the end of slavery and the end of the war and the religious elements of God justifying this, you can see also that many of the people who lamented the death of Lincoln saw him as a kind of Christ figure and in tradition with the martyrs. And he would also represent a secularized, or what would eventually be known as postmodern martyr figure that you would see again in Martin Luther King, you would see again in Gandhi, you would see it even in strange forms like Jim Morrison or John Lennon or even Dimebag Darrell. The secular martyrdom. So again, it's not that these things didn't exist before, but before the American project or the modern era, the martyrs, the ideal human being, would be justified by the church. If you look at the history of the saints in the Orthodox and Catholic tradition, they are saints because the church sanctified their sainthood. Whereas Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King, so on and so forth, these are sanctified by popularity. They're sanctified by history. They're sanctified by humans. And it would be yet another mutation that would accumulate and be added to the bizarre mix of belief systems that we have here in America. And one other element that I think should really be brought to light is the Unitarian impulse. You probably know of the Unitarian Universalist Church. It was actually, for me, when I was 20, I was dating a Unitarian Universalist, and so I went because of her. But it was the only church that I became a member of, other than my Southern Baptist beginnings, on purpose. And I think that even though the Unitarians are rightly ridiculed as rainbow people with all sorts of perhaps unhealthy and unsightly cultural mutations festering beneath their authority, they still, in their core, represent something very beautiful about the American spirit or the modern spirit or the spirit of openness. They're called Unitarians because they believe in the unity of God. And they came to believe, you see it especially in people like Emerson and the various transcendentalists, they came to believe that all religions were pointing towards that God. And the universalist aspect is that no God who truly loved his creation would ever condemn any of them to hell permanently. And so the rejection of eternal damnation is the root of the universalists. And these were two different sects. They came out of Congregationalism, but two different sects that eventually would merge in the 1960s as the Unitarian Universalist Church. But they're very, very important. We've heard Warren speak very eloquently at the last Meriwether Academy on the beauty of Ralph Waldo Emerson's and Thoreau's viewpoint. And this is inextricably linked to that Unitarian impulse. But at that time, right, we're still kind of in a fuzzy way in the late 1800s, moving our way into the 20th century. America was still homogenous, so to speak. Very much the empowered class were Europeans, mostly Anglo-Europeans, what we now would call WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, with some other kind of European monkey peoples. And then you also had the African slaves. And the African slaves, both when they were slaves and then even when freed, represent a very distinctive class, right? And so you already had this diversity, but it was still easy to conceive of and in a way manageable diversity. And then, of course, you have the always forgotten Native Americans who got chewed up and spit out with almost no real compensation other than casinos and firewater and OxyContin. But at that time, there was still very much a force or a presence in America, and it created this mosaic in the American psyche that was quite unique. Carl Jung would remark on it later in the 20th century, this kind of beautiful mongrel, in my words, that is America. And yet it was still fairly contained. And so you had the Protestants, you begin to see more and more Catholics and Orthodox. You had Jews, of course. You had some Muslims. Actually, you had a significant number of Muslims early on in the slave community, right? The black slaves, I've seen various estimates, but as high as like 40% were Muslims when they arrived in America. It's probably lower, but who knows? And then, of course, the various kinds of tribal religions of the Africans and the various tribal religions of the Indians. So America already had this diversity of religious thought in mind. And one of the culminations of this that is looked back upon, especially in religious studies, as exceedingly important, was the World Parliament of Religion, which occurred along with the Chicago, as part of the Chicago World's Fair. And so this was held in 1893, and it was the first real meeting of, like intentional real meeting of all of these different traditions. You had Christians, of course, Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox. You had Jews, of course. You had Muslims, of course. But you also had the Hindus. You had the Jains. You had, I think the Jains. I think the Sikhs. You had the Hindus. You had the Buddhists. You had Confucians. You had Taoists. You had a number of views represented, and the goal, even if it was run by a Presbyterian minister who insisted that the Lord's Prayer be read or recited by everyone, who still believed that by bringing these people together, perhaps they could find some kind of commonality. And one of the standout figures was Swami Vivekananda, or as President Trump so articulately pronounced his name when speaking to India in 2018, Swami Vivekananda. And Vivekananda, like Ramakrishna before him, believed that all religions were pointing towards the same God. He was one to invoke the metaphor of the mountain, that all religions are paths up the same mountain to the same peak. This is kind of deep in late Hindu ideas. And if you look at the Hindu religion in general, the Hindu religion, most of the predominant strains of it do have that universalist impulse, which also explains a lot of the attraction of people like Emerson towards Hinduism. The idea that God is one with many, many masks. Of course, Vivekananda or Vivekananda was universalist, but he was also a supremacist. So that he believed that yes, all religions were paths towards the one God, but the Hindus were just better at it and had a much clearer view as to what was happening. And I don't want to leave you with the impression, though, that this was some kind of just kumbaya gathering in which everyone agreed that God is one and we're all one. There were a lot of dissenting voices. Oddly enough, especially among the Buddhists, who saw their own views derided. And, Buddhists are not particularly theistic, so they saw their own views derided. And, just to paraphrase one of the Japanese Zen practitioners, we know, Rika, you act like this to us. And this was very important, too, because, yes, you can bring different peoples together. But you will never necessarily fuse them into one melting pot. And that tension is all part of our own quests. How much of this diversity can you tolerate? And of that diversity, how much of it is of value to you? What combination is of value to you and your family and your country. And we'll get into that in the next section. All right, fellas, I appreciate you hanging in there with me on this. And just so you know, definitely going to open up the floor to all the criticism, questions, and critique, or whatever. Those are the same things, criticism and critique, but the human thesaurus over here. The floor will be open before this is all over with. But till then, you're stuck with me. So, what are the fruits of religious freedom in America? I think there are a lot of beautiful fruits to religious freedom. Even the freedom of the Orthodox to maintain communities that are closed off to the outside and internally consistent and exclusive to the wider secular world. And the Protestant tradition, which I come from, and the freedom to interpret the Bible according to one's own conscience, one's own intellect, another beautiful fruit of American freedom. And in its own dark and bizarre way, even some of the more perverse artistic and spiritual flourishes of this culture are, if not to be embraced, at least to be understood and appreciated. And that's where we're going to go now. In the very quick summary of American history from my own twisted point of view, it's centered on Jesus. It's centered on Christianity. And the most difficult aspect of Christianity, at least to my mind, comes out of the Sermon on the Mount. The extreme demands to love one's enemy, to turn the other cheek, the warning that to commit adultery in one's own heart is to commit adultery, the distinction between God and mammon, and the exclusive dictum that you cannot serve two masters, either God or mammon. And I think that shows in the development of the culture of the Shakers, perhaps even the Oneidas. But it's an insistence that it's not to be a Christianity in which one declares a belief, but a Christianity in which one is to literally sacrifice oneself for the greater good. Albeit, in the case of the Shakers, the Oneidas, and the communalist groups, and even the more corporate groups like the Mormons, growing into strange directions. Another dictum in Christianity that's unique to Christianity and Buddhism alone is the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And it's an active principle. You seek out those who need and do unto them as you would have them do unto you. Now, in my own conception, below that you have the silver rule, espoused by Rabbi Hillel before Jesus, and also by Confucius. Do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. It's a hands-off altruism, you might say. And then below that, a very common dictum that is adhered to in any American corporate society or any kind of salesman: do unto others so that they will do unto you. To manipulate others to do unto you. This is actually codified in an ancient Egyptian tablet. And then below that, you have the iron rule of the Hells Angels, put forward by Sonny Barger. And that is, treat me nice and I'll treat you better. Treat me bad and I'll treat you worse. The primal iron rule of the Hells Angels, of the Vikings, of the Bantu, of pretty much everyone of a tribal culture. But then below that, you have the black rule, put forward by Aleister Crowley in 1904, which is simply, do what thou wilt. Do what you will. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. That was the central theme of his Book of the Law, which he claims he channeled while in Egypt from the spirit Iowas. And he sat on it for a number of years, I think even maybe over a decade, before it became a central ethos to the Thelemite groups, such as the OTO, Ordo Templi Orientis, of which Crowley was a founder. Aleister Crowley was a strange character, a funny guy, very witty, very dark, very acerbic, sarcastic, very brilliant. But ultimately, you can imagine the fruit of this idea, the fruit of the black rule, do what thou wilt, is not only a declaration of liberty, a liberty from all previous laws and dictums, but a recipe for cruelty and disaster. But freedom nonetheless. It is the essence of liberty. Do what thou wilt. Now, Crowley set himself against the traditional concepts of religion put forward by the Jews, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, but especially the Christians. He was raised part of a very extreme sect of Christians in England. His father was a minister and also the owner of a brewery. And very early on in his life, especially due to his ravenous sexual appetites, he wanted freedom from this. And he wanted freedom from the altruistic ideals of the Golden Rule. He dubbed himself the Great Beast. His mother used to call him the Beast, but he dubbed himself the Great Beast. He took as his magical number 666. And it would be just another eccentric doing strange things with his inheritance were it not for his profound influence downstream of his magical working. You can see the influence in rock and roll. It's very apparent. You can even see the influence in later communal culture. So in the case of rock and roll, for instance, the Rolling Stones were involved with Kenneth Anger doing satanic films. And Kenneth Anger, of course, was a devotee to Crowley's method of magical working. You can see it in the Beatles on the cover for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Thank you. Aleister Crowley features there along with Carl Jung and others. You can see it in Led Zeppelin. Jimmy Page was obsessed with Aleister Crowley, bought Aleister Crowley's house in Scotland. And on down the line, Tool, Marilyn Manson, Ministry, all these guys hearken back to the Crowleyan tradition as a motivating factor in their art. H.R. Giger, whom last night I told you I visited for the second time his gallery in Switzerland. And Giger was also very much influenced by this tradition of the Crowleyan do what thou wilt ethos. In fact, in his personal collection at the very top of the museum is a portrait of Aleister Crowley. And the satanic imagery is largely derived, and even the aesthetic of the art is derived from Crowley's own work. So a profound influence on the culture. And as far as communal culture goes, he had one of the early communes. I mean, we know that the Shakers, the Oneidas, this wasn't unusual. And by the way, just, you think commune, you think communism. The communes were sprouting up all over Europe as well, and Marxism, communism as we now know it, comes out of that brew. It wasn't as if Karl Marx came up with communism. He just simply put an industrial stamp on it. So Crowley is important not only because of you could say the boldness of putting forward this idea of do what thou wilt, but also the cultural and spiritual influence. And I don't know if there's a direct connection. I imagine there is not, but it's at least worth noting. As I mentioned before, H.P. Lovecraft, the author H.P. Lovecraft, comes out of Rhode Island, again founded on the principle of religious liberty. And Lovecraft began writing his first stories just after this declaration of do what thou wilt in the Book of the Law. Now, one would have to indulge a degree of primitive and atavistic superstition to believe that they were in any way connected, but I am both primitive and atavistic, so I think that it's pretty clear. Crowley opened up the door to demons. Now, Crowley's influence wouldn't only be on the culture, there would also be an influence on technology. And we'll get there in just a second, but I just want to highlight the importance of World War I and World War II on the development of America, the prominence of America as a world power, the influence of American culture on the rest of the world, and of course the technological ambition and supremacy of America over the rest of the world, at least up to our present time, who knows how much longer. In the age of colonization, some of the most important technologies would have been the ship, the sailboat, and sailing ships. It would have been the carriage and the wheel, right? It would have been certain useful agricultural mechanisms like water wheels and windmills. And of course, the printing press was extraordinarily important. You know, Warren was explaining how interconnected, and Turbeville explained how interconnected the printing press was with the American founding, the ability to produce media. By the time you get to World War I, now you've got the addition of kind of early airplanes, cars, tanks, things like this, or armored vehicles, and of course machine guns. And then after World War II, you have pretty sophisticated bombers, sophisticated tanks, sophisticated machine guns, and of course the introduction of the atom bomb. And that would determine not only the course of history, but the tone of history, because after the atom bomb, it was known that due to the ingenuity of mathematicians and technicians and the resources of a war economy, that humanity not only stood under the threat of possible Armageddon by divine will or possible natural disaster or disease, humanity could possibly be destroyed by the ingenuity of these people, leading to the Cold War and mutually assured destruction. And that period of leading up to the end of World War II and after World War II, a few defining things. You had the atom bomb, right? First detonated in the deserts of New Mexico, and then detonated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And whatever your opinions of that as an ethical decision, one thing's for sure, when they obliterated mostly Christian Japanese in that act, quite possibly unnecessarily, they showed that humanity has the power of the gods. And leading up to that moment, the end of World War II, you also had the development of computer systems, the first computer systems, of which one of the prominent ones, ENIAC, the first digital computer. And its first use in the aftermath of World War II, 1945, was to model thermonuclear explosions, the possibility of, rather than the fission explosion of uranium or plutonium, fusion of hydrogen, massive sun-like powers unleashed as weaponry, and comprehended by way of the digital computer, again, ENIAC. You also had, in 1945, the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library, the cache of documents that were hidden in the 4th century by the Gnostics, who were being persecuted by the Catholic Church and other Orthodox factions. And what that did was opened up a window onto alternative, you could say, or heretical Christianity, which before had been understood by way of the heresiologists, the church fathers who said this is evil, this is wrong. And now you had the exposure of this novel way of looking at God, looking at Christ, looking at the world, looking at Satan, looking at evil from the people who espoused it and believed it. Very diverse set of beliefs, by the way. And then a year later, you had the discovery, that was in Cairo, or outside of Cairo, Egypt, near the village of Nag Hammadi. you also had the next year the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Levant, which gave you, again, another view of what early Christianity may have been influenced by. It's believed these were Essenes. You can see much of what we would consider to be the novel teachings of Jesus expressed in these documents, including this idea of warring factions of angels and devils, and many others, rituals of purity, all these things. And so this is a dramatic period, not only technologically, but also ideologically. It challenged what was left of orthodox authority over the interpretation of the Bible and the interpretation of the person of Christ and humanity descending down from that. So what does this have to do with Aleister Crowley? There was a disciple of Aleister Crowley. His name was Jack Parsons. Perhaps you've heard of him. And Jack Parsons was completely devoted to Aleister Crowley's system of sex magic encoded in the Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO. He was in direct contact with Aleister Crowley. He exchanged letters with him until Crowley's death. He also sent Crowley money because Crowley was never very good with money, and in fact died destitute. According to the apocryphal tale of his death, he died alone in a flop house wearing nothing but a magical hat and a magical ring, holding a magical wand, and Crowley's last words were reported to be, "I am perplexed." Jack Parsons was there till the end, and Jack Parsons, aside from being an occultist, and aside from raising the hackles of conservatives in and around California, he lived in Pasadena, was a rocket scientist, and in fact a pioneering rocket scientist, a Stanford graduate, and one of the founding members of one of the people founding the Jet Propulsion Laboratories housed there in Pasadena, if I'm not mistaken. And so, this idea of like going to the moon, this idea of the power of rocketry, is intimately tied, at least in the person of Parsons, with the occult. And it's a somewhat obscure and a marginal aspect of the whole history of rocketry and the space program and all of that. But I think it's important not just because of its bizarre nature, but also because it is, in some sense, like the quest for space, of that next frontier. After all of America has basically been conquered and there are few frontiers left, that quest for space has a number of esoteric or occult underpinnings, as does the enterprise of nuclear weaponry. So you're probably familiar with Oppenheimer's obsession with Sanskrit and the Hindu tradition. And he famously said he recalled upon seeing that first mushroom cloud a passage from the Bhagavad Gita, whom Aleister Crowley was also obsessed with, in which I am become death, destroyer of worlds, which comes out of the Bhagavad Gita. And in the space program itself, you have a number of Freemasons, so that Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, am I correct on this? Freemasons. And you have a number of kind of sci-fi sensibilities going into all of it. We'll get back there in a second. But on Parsons, so something significant happened, at least in his mind, in 1946, the Babylon working, as he called it. And it was an attempt through sex magic to call into being a liberatory entity, you might say the Antichrist, to destroy all of what came before and arise as this emissary of the will. And this was conducted in partnership with a gentleman you probably know, L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard, Navy guy, I think intelligence officer, if I'm not mistaken. Certainly Navy, who had befriended Parsons and proceeded to bilk him. He ended up scamming him out of tons and tons of his fortune. But Parsons had this communal home. He called it the parsonage. And everything was kind of shared in common, especially sexual partners. And Hubbard was working with him in these magical rituals to kind of summon Scarlet Woman. Hubbard disappears because Hubbard promises to go purchase some yachts from Florida with Parsons' money and just disappears with his girlfriend. And Parsons chases him down, gets some of the money back, comes back somewhat despondent. But another character is introduced into this love nest. And this is this red-haired woman. Her name escapes me at the moment. I will not venture to pull it out from the dead cells in the back of my brain. But a very vibrant, also naval veteran. And they proceed to try to create this magical child, this moon child, this Antichrist figure. They fail to do so, and Parsons, not long afterwards, dies from an explosion in his laboratory, his kind of garage laboratory. Some believe it was an accident, some believe it was suicide, not unlike Meriwether Lewis. Some believe it was murder. Nobody really knows, but the impact that it left, again, on the culture is profound. And the kind of dark undertone of this occult fervor that bleeds into the technological ambitions of the West, again, I think cannot be ignored. I don't think it should be the sole focus. There are many, many people, perhaps the vast majority of people working on these technologies who were Christians, devoted Christians, who believed what they were doing was for the service and glory of God. But this other element is the fruit of religious liberty. And I want to focus in on a place that I've visited 3 times now, first by happenstance and afterwards, just whenever I've gone through that area of the country, I can't stay away, and that's Trinidad, Colorado. And Trinidad, with its Christian namesake, is kind of like the burned over district of upstate New York, a petri dish in which these mimetic or ideological mutations are flourishing. One of the first historical points about Trinidad, Colorado goes back to the late 1800s. It was known as the Ludlow Massacre, which was a massacre of mining workers who were striking. And the miners had been ejected from their homes. In that time, it was not uncommon for a mining company or any company to set up housing for their workers. And due to failed negotiations over wages, they were kicked out of their homes and they were put in these tent cities. And they continued to strike and they continued to rebel. And the hired security from the mining companies would attack them, kill. The numbers vary, we'll say a dozen plus, maybe dozens of people, but especially a woman and children whom she was shielding, hiding in one of the tents, which they set on fire and burned her to death. And it became a symbol for the cruelty of capitalists and the nobility of workers. And much of the momentum that would become, say, the 8-hour workday or the 40-hour week or healthcare or many of the things we take for granted now or used to up until a decade or so ago, were won by not only the people fighting and banding together against the owners of these companies, but also the symbols, what Turbeville pointed out rightly to be propaganda. The propaganda that the evil capitalists attack these poor socialists, well, it worked. And I think it worked for the better. And that occurred just north of Trinidad, Colorado. But you fast forward a little over half a century, you got some other peculiar cultural mutations forming. And one in 1965 is known as Drop City, a commune, an art commune, which attracted a lot of the early hippie types. It attracted Timothy Leary's attention. I believe Jim Morrison even visited at one point. It was a seminal experiment, very much in the tradition of the late 1700s Shakers or the 1800s Oneidas, so on and so forth. Everything is shared in common, and this is to be a model for how to conduct oneself as a society in the face of an otherwise corrupt mainstream culture. They built these strange houses, kind of geodesic domes of sort. They're based on Buckminster Fuller's ideas, the buckyball and these sorts of things. They were kind of trashy looking. There was a lot of junk thrown around, and a lot of acid eaten, like a ton of drugs. But that's, kind of, again, it's in the same vein as our man Parsons, who was also eating tons of mescaline, using cocaine, I think maybe morphine, Aleister Crowley doing the same. And I failed to mention that, of course, Aleister Crowley's Abbey of Thelema in Europe, which predates Jack Parsons' communal effort by decades, was also a commune with open sexual relationships and plenty of drugs. A lot of people went insane. One dude died. And I'm sure that a proctologist would be horrified by the results of much of what was going on there. But the Drop City, aside from being, one of the first and most famous communes, and a model that did spread quite rapidly across the country as the cultural revolution of the 60s amped up, was accentuated by and complemented by another operation that would begin in Trinidad, Colorado in 1969, which would later be known as the sex change capital of the United States. And a Dr. Stanley Bieber, or Biber, was really the first major American transgender surgeon. This had begun in Weimar, Germany, and had been around for decades, but he was the one who really put it on the map. And when you go to Trinidad, Colorado today, it's very interesting. There are a lot of historical monuments to the Ludlow Massacre. There are some, like if you go to their history museum, obviously they'll have information about Drop City and a ton of a lot of adulation for Bieber or Biber's sex change operations. But the town itself is pretty nondescript. It does, though, kind of represent a cross-section of American culture, because you have this economically depressed town, and at least in my experience of it, a lot of conservatives, a lot of liberals, a lot of different types. You've got hot yoga over here, you've got the guy selling guns over here, and you have tons and tons of dispensaries, weed dispensaries. Like so many that even I'm kind of upset by it. Like maybe there's something bad happening. Maybe the appearance of this represents a kind of degeneracy in American culture that is perhaps the direct descendant or direct fruits of the kind of loose libertarian culture that would lead to communalism, transgender operations, and so on and so forth. And I myself, I have mixed feelings about all of this, because I do believe that freedom is the best path forward, but the fruits of that freedom really do have to be reckoned with. And one of my earliest direct experiences of this was at Zindik Farm. Zindik is Sanskrit for heretic, and Zindik Farm was formed in California by a man who called himself and his wife Wolf and Errol Zindik. And they took on the name, we're the heretics, proudly so, against what they called the death culture, the outward mainstream American culture, which they believed was destroying not only the ecosystems of the world, but also ultimately instituting a kind of soft slavery over the workers that needed to band together in small communal groups with these social experiments in order to ultimately overturn what they would consider to be a horrifically perverse culture. They believed it would destroy itself. They believed it would destroy itself sometime around the year 2000. Obviously, that didn't happen. But when I showed up, it was in the late 90s. And I learned three things from them. The first thing I learned was that organic food really is better than normal food. They grew organic vegetables and had only humanely slaughtered meat to the extent they ate it. And these were very healthy, good-looking people. A+. I also took with me a kind of dictum or slogan that they had, which is, cult is short for culture. And I believe that's true. Before that, I'd only experienced the wider culture, but what I experienced there were about 70 people there at the time. They had moved from their founding in 1969 in California to Texas, and then had moved sometime before I arrived in the late 90s to Vero Beach, Florida. But when, cult is short for culture. This was a 70-person strong, concentrated cult. And they believed the outward culture was a death cult, kind of like the Shakers. The Shakers saw the outside world, this evil place, but what we're cultivating is good. And it was flawed in dramatic ways. But it did give me a sense not only of what happens when you concentrate people around an idea and the power, the real power it generates, and the intolerance that it generates towards the outside, and the intolerance that it stimulates in the outside towards them. But also, and this is getting into the superstitious woo, sort of psychic connections, shared dreams, thoughts passing from one person to the next, injuries that would oftentimes move through the group, right? Like strange coincidences. And I realized that, in fact, they were correct. Cult is short for culture, because what we live in out here, especially in America, is an interlocking mosaic of cults. So you can almost not see that you're in a cult or you're in these overlapping cults because there's so many of them and it feels so normal. But that's exactly where we're at. It's exactly where every human being on earth, all but the most liberated Gnostic, is trapped in the cult either of their birth or the cults of their choosing. And the third thing I learned is that definitely if you're going to have a polyamorous cult, you should use a condom. I didn't learn this the hard way. But aside from thoughts being spread around the group and various injuries, herpes was a problem, as was gonorrhea and chlamydia. And unplanned pregnancies, which children were being born into this. And it was pretty stunning, especially their denial that HIV existed. They thought that HIV did not cause AIDS. They disbanded in 2013. I don't know how many of them lived, and I don't know the status of their STDs, but I do know that their legacy, not unlike the Shakers, the Oneidas, the parsonage of Jack Parsons, the Abbey of Thelema, that despite their disbanding, that legacy still lives on and it is an inspiration for other very similar groups which still exist not just in America, but across the world. And all this is a herald and a kind of microcosm, almost a caricature of what American culture has become. Because, we ended the last talk on the world parliament of religions and this idea that all religions can and should come together for mutual understanding and perhaps even arrive at some kind of perennial philosophy, some sort of deep and abiding divinity that's beyond the outward forms. And that was just an idea in 1893, but come 1965 with the Immigration Act, the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, coming on the heels also of the Civil Rights Movement, America began an earnest and actual physical experiment in this because that opened up the floodgates to Indian immigrants and Arab immigrants and Asian immigrants and African immigrants. America is a nation of immigrants, yeah, kind of, but it was nothing like after the Hart-Celler Act. And now America is flooded not only with these ideas, not only are Americans reading about Hindus, but they've got the palaces of their gods being erected next to their, Texas oil refinery. And they can now go visit a Tibetan tantric teacher in the foothills even of East Tennessee. And suddenly something changed in America that it was no longer easily defined. What an American was due to a kind of retroactive definition of America could no longer be easily defined. There was this mutation, this hybridization, this mongrelization, not only of bloodlines, but of spiritual inheritance, of culture. Fusion restaurants where you can get Mexican egg rolls. Astounding. Just astounding. And you look at the flourishing of religion in America as opposed to any other country, and yes, you see it also in other Western nations, and you see it historically in others, but nothing quite like America. So the Hindu obsession, you had the rise of ISKCON, the International Society of Krishna Consciousness. You had all these Buddhist temples and Buddhist teachers showing up. You have crazy tantrists such as Osho and others. You have these Jewish communes, this kind of a recreation of the Jewish shtetl of Israel popping up around America. You have Christian communities that are closing themselves off into, just right down the road here, you can find them. Christian communities shutting themselves off from the world. You have eco-extremists, people who worship Gaia or some scientific version of Gaia, who are willing to attack the machine on behalf of a tree. Julia Butterfly living up in a tree and shitting in buckets and remaining hot, nevertheless, with her hairy legs and her hairy armpits. Astounding cultural mutations. And you have the development of this sort of sci-fi aesthetic. And you have the development of the back to nature aesthetic. And you have people who have plastic-ish clothes that look like they just came out of a cowboy shop because they did. And maybe they're not cowboys. Maybe they're just dudes. And you have also the development of tranny babies, of polycules, of every imaginable combination of culture. And yes, it is outside of the mainstream, but it has become much, much, much more part of the mainstream. Radical atheists, radical Muslims, right here in the good old US of A. And all of this ferment amounts to chaos, a chaos that has to be navigated. And so to conclude this, I just want to bring your attention to one other figure, a real American hero, Timothy Leary, Dr. Timothy Leary, who really began his prominent career anyway as a psychologist at Harvard, working with the CIA. And he would take mushrooms on a trip to Mexico that would change his entire idea of what it meant to be a human and what reality was and how one could come to higher and higher realities. And he would get turned on to LSD, which was first manufactured, first by the Swiss, but then U.S. labs, government funded, really pure, really good. Pretty sure I've had some of it. And Timothy Leary would then convert from a kind of staid, suit-wearing, maybe spook psychologist to the psychedelic guru. And he started taking on the Hindu aesthetic, right? And if you've ever been to India, you know that like the whole of the 60s is basically like this attempt to play act and LARP as Hindus. And he openly declared he was beginning a new religion. And he openly declared that this new religion was one of freedom, was one of the will. And he would later say that he was indebted not only to Aleister Crowley for the spiritual freedom that he brought into the world with the Book of the Law, but he at one point on, I think, a heavy dose of mescaline or some other psychedelic in the desert believed that he was the reincarnation of Aleister Crowley. Deeply entwined. Everything we think of when we think of the counterculture cannot be, you see the prints of Timothy Leary on it. And again, descending from this infernal dictum, do what thou wilt. And Timothy Leary would go on in his later life to put forward a principle which he called smile. Because as the 60s moved on into the depressing 70s, and the 80s brought with it the explosion of the personal computer and digital technologies that the masses could use, and Steve Jobs and Apple and the garage-based geniuses and all of this, Leary had to get a new gig, and I'm not saying he did it cynically, but he definitely evolved, right? And started putting out a new kind of vibe. And so he went from the psychedelic guru to the cybernetic guru. And he began preaching about a world in which computers would not only dominate human culture, this is in the 80s, but would enable the average person to become a magician. In a classic essay that was published in 1988, Reality Bites magazine, with a confusing and convoluted and probably psychedelically impaired headline, which was something to the effect of digital polytheism, load and run, something or another. He talked openly about how the personal computer, like psychedelics, was a way for the average person to conduct magic. And he opens it with a poem from Aleister Crowley. "We place no reliance on virgin or pigeon. Our method is science. Our aim is religion." And he goes on with his co-author to describe how the computer, in essence, is a ritual chamber in which one can steer oneself through reality. Because remember, Aleister Crowley, his definition of magic was to cause change in conformity with the will, so that now the average person could change not only their consciousness dramatically with this digital technology, which they could create these digital realities and inhabit, but also the outer world. And another of his classic phrases, and I think it's very true when you look around at the kids today with their big pupiled eyes staring at their phones, was that the PC is the LSD of the 90s. It just breaks open reality. And all the traditional forms are now in question. Another of his dictums: question authority, think for yourself. Think for yourself, question authority. Always with your own inner consciousness as the guide. And he saw this unfolding mass of digital and psychedelic and cultural and multicultural and multiracial, multisexual, polysexual chaos as not something to necessarily be afraid of, but something that one must simply learn how to steer through, to navigate through. Kybernon, the rudder of the ship. How do you steer through it? And he believed it was through embracing the technology, making sure that the technology remained in the hands of the people, and to never ever accept any kind of authoritarian regime or any kind of oppressive force whatsoever, that one's will should always be the guide. And this would in turn inspire a man whom I've gotten to know reasonably well. His name's Max Moore. And Max Moore, the reason that we say the word transhumanism at all is because of Max Moore. And Max Moore, aside from being like this big, hulking, buff mutant of a man, has a beautiful wife, Natasha Vita Moore, also a proponent of transhumanism, whom he met at Timothy Leary's house. And so you can see this thread beginning with a black magician and moving through a rocket scientist and through a psychedelic guru into, you might say, the prophet of a transhuman future. And that is where we will begin in our next talk and then wrap it up and let you guys berate me. Our final exploration is the colonization of the cosmos. Beginning the story, I talked about America as a frontier, America as an experiment, as a kind of petri dish for mimetic mutations. And that first frontier was the natural world. How do we conquer that? And you might say that the second frontier was the mind and society of the American public. How do you seed the minds and therefore change the society? And these are all competing points of view. As I told you in the beginning, this telling of history, this very brief overview, is very idiosyncratic, coming from the warped mind of an acid casualty, but hopefully offering up something that's of value, something that is of worth. So what's the next frontier? And we hear in the science fiction milieu that the next frontier is space, outer space. And America, of course, being the first to land on the moon, if you believe in the moon. America is poised to spearhead that next adventure. But I would say there are 4 realms into which we are still pushing, colonizing, altering. Yes, you have outer space. Once you've mapped the entire Earth and exploited its resources, the obvious logical next step in the scientific paradigm is to go out into outer space. But there's also the inner space. And every possible tool is being utilized to explore that space as well. We talked about psychedelics, and whatever your opinions on psychedelic drugs may be, psychedelics undoubtedly open up doorways for one to explore one's own mind, one's own consciousness, in a sort of lucid dream. And you also have the meditative practices given to us from Western church fathers, St. Ignatius being a key example, but many others. Adding to that the Eastern practices of meditation, Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist, so on and so forth. And also the psychic experiments that are being done to uncover, unlock, and prove the existence of psychic power. You don't want to get in front of a dissertation committee or a board of directors and make a whole lot of strong claims about psychic power, but the reality is that there is a science of the psionic, and that science does show, at least statistically, that the human mind does seem to have some sort of interaction with the outer world. Parenthetically, I want to bring up one of the origins of scientific study of psychic power. As I said earlier, the first men to walk on the moon, go to the moon, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, Freemasons. And assuming you don't think that this is a Spaconic conspiracy to fool the public with theater and badly rendered shuttles and pods, they were the esoteric emissaries to other worlds. But another astronaut that doesn't get as much attention is Edgar Mitchell, who was in one of the later Apollo missions, walked on the moon, but he had this mystical experience from space looking back to the Earth, and he saw the whole of the Earth, this enclosed circle, and he saw no borders. He simply saw the Earth. And he realized that humanity is one and that there is a mystical force that drives the creation of nature and of human beings and of human societies. And he would return to Earth and he would found the Institute for the Noetic Sciences, which is one of the leading investigative bodies that is looking for actual scientific statistical evidence of psychic power. So there's a link there, again parenthetically, a link there between the quest to go into outer space and the quest to go into inner space. And there's also the mutations of culture itself, sort of social space. And you can see very clearly that that space is fertile ground for all kinds of mutations, many of them very positive. The ability for a person to do good to another person is, I think, far greater and amplified by the technologies at our disposal, but also very clearly those technologies are used for atomization and for destruction. I'm not saying that technology is neutral. I don't really believe that. I think that certain technologies tend towards certain effects. This was put very succinctly by Peter Thiel, with whom I have many, many disagreements. But he said that AI is essentially communist in its nature, whereas Bitcoin or decentralized cryptocurrencies are inherently libertarian. Whether you accept that thesis or not, it definitely points to this notion that certain technologies have certain tendencies. And our social technologies, such as social media, have had incredibly ironic effects. The atomization of people, especially young men, and it's incredibly anti-social. And last but not least, the digital space, which is intimately connected with the social space. We are now in what my friend James Poulos calls a cyborg vivarium. We are basically the subjects of a vast global experiment, and the cultural mutations, the social mutations, are all now wired, interconnected, monitored, and manipulated by a digital space, a virtual space, cyber space. And so you have those four frontiers that we're still working towards, and all of us are going to have to figure out what our paths are, whether it's together as brothers or whether it is individually or some combination thereof. We're at least vicariously probing outer space. We're probing inner space if you're adventurous. We're left with these experiments in the social space, and there's the yawning void of digital space into which our souls are being poured and crystallized. Now, I also talked about, beyond the frontiers, the proliferation of diversity in America. And as much as I might come off as someone who is against diversity, I'm actually not. I think, for instance, mitochondria, that was a great idea, and I'm glad that we ultimately, as eukaryotic organisms, incorporated mitochondria. They are our friends. And I'm very glad, very, very glad that we have hip-hop and Negro spirituals. And I think that reminds us all that the great hierarchy of power on this earth can land pretty heavy on anyone's head. And any one of us could be humming those tunes or rapping those sick bars. And that diversity of the American psyche, you could see two main poles there emerging in the modern era. Of course, you have that age-old spiritual point of view, especially Christian, but as I said earlier, increasingly diverse. So there's no longer just Christian, but it's everything. All of it is considered part of the American fabric, whether it be Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Jain, Buddhist, Sikh, Confucian, Taoist, communist, capitalist, Democrat, fascist, so on and so forth. All of that's woven into the fabric of the American psyche. But there's a polarization that is pointed to very often, generically referred to as science and religion. And in the scientific point of view, you have a deadened recapitulation of the spiritual point of view. Just take the spiritual point of view of the Christians alone. You have the outpouring of the universe from the spoken word of God. God speaks light into existence. He separates the light from the dark. He populates the light and the dark with the moon and the sun, vice versa. He separates the sea from the heavens and then the land from the sea, and populates the heavens with the birds and the seas with the fishes, and the land with animals and the creeping things and the plants, and of course culminating in the human. And there you have Adam and you have Eve. And then from the fall to the spread of the human seed across the planet, you have a diversification. And you might say that's just simple mythology, but I think that if you look deeply at the lessons that are taught in that spread, you'll find not only moral relevance, but also some clarification on what it means to be human. And there's a distinct end in the Christian version. One of the unique aspects of the Western tradition is this recognition of history, this arc of history. The Eastern traditions tended towards, well, almost universally, really, a cyclical point of view. They envisioned vast worlds upon worlds upon worlds upon worlds, but they were cyclical. Whereas the Western tradition is one with a beginning, and especially in the case of the Christian and Muslim stories, a distinct end. And also in the Jewish tradition, a distinct end. And in the Christian tradition, that end is an apocalypse. It's the end of an old world, but the beginning of a new. And it's spiritual in its nature. Whether you are a very materialist theologian or the most Gnostic, anti-materialist, transcendent sort of teacher, there's still in the religious tradition this being, God, and these hierarchies of beings, the angels and the fallen angels, the demons, the spirits, all these things that populate this world, much vaster than this room and the trees beyond, the cities beyond, and the space beyond. It is a vast cosmos. The scientific point of view is dead. Energetic, but dead. And so it begins in the Orthodox version with a big bang and the condensation of energy into matter, into protons and electrons and neutrons, hydrogen and stars and exploding stars and heavier elements and galaxies and planets, so on and so forth, that then, at least from our perspective, culminate in Earth, and then the progression of biological evolution, the progression of cultural or psychic evolution with humans. And the tension between those two worlds is almost irreconcilable, but there are many who try. And as much as I'm averse to turning towards Europe for any inspiration at all whatsoever, other than for coffee and cheese and bread, the figure of Teilhard de Chardin stands out as someone who tried to merge those two worlds, the spiritual and the scientific. And de Chardin he lived and wrote mostly in the late 1800s and then throughout the first half of the 20th century. And he was both a Jesuit priest and a paleontologist. And his view of the world was an attempt at embracing both of those points of view. And he truly believed that the world was created with the Spirit of God infused into it. And he truly believed that the figure of Christ was supreme above all others. And he truly believed in the human as something sacred and precious. But he also could not deny the facts of science. And as he's digging through the fossils and the various geological strata, the way he came to envision the world was layers. So our world begins with the lithosphere, the elements, the mountains and the seas, geology. And above that you have this layer, the biosphere, the bugs, the plants, the animals, us, our bodies. But then above that, with the creation of human beings and the flourishing of human culture, the noosphere, from nous, the Greek, the mind, maybe more specifically the overmind, what Ralph Waldo Emerson would call the oversoul. But for him, it was more specific, it was more scientific, and he saw the creation not only of fire, campfires, bows and arrows, then eventually cities, streets, writing, art, architecture, on up to, in his day, the telegraph, the radio, the sea lanes with ever more sophisticated ships, and highways with ever more sophisticated vehicles. This interlinking, interconnected body, the noosphere, the world of culture, the world of the mind, overlaid upon this. And again, this is the early 20th century, and he thought of it in a sense like a brain, this interconnected web. And many later futurists would look back at his vision of the noosphere as a prediction of the internet, the interconnection of all people and all ideas by way of technology. But he was a techno-optimist. I disagree with him on this, but it has to be appreciated how vivid and brilliant his point of view was. And he believed that all of this was an expression of God, in the will of God. And just as the book of Revelation speaks of Jesus as the Alpha and Omega, he believed that from the Alpha of the Big Bang, we are moving towards the Omega point. The Omega point isn't a time or a place. It's just a direction. And that direction is one in which you have ever more complex entities that are ever more interconnected. And at the same time, the freedom of individuals within that network to exert their own will. He was not some sort of crypto-Crowleyan. But he did believe that at the same time that evolution was driving us towards interconnection and understanding and more peaceable existence, a kind of collective, that within that is the individual struggling for moral clarity and for greater and greater freedom and expression. And so Desjardins saw this omega point as the realization of the human, which is the realization of Christ, which sounds an awful lot like the Shakers or the Oneidas on earth, or at least in the material sphere, that we as a species are bringing into existence the material manifestation of Christ through our cultural, religious, and technological efforts. And he also, aside from having a prescient apprehension of what would later be called the singularity with the omega point, he, in essence, was among the first, anyway, to use the term transhumanism. And this was in, most likely, it's not really clear, but most likely the early 50s, 1950s. And for him, transhumanism was the fruits of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Transhumanism was the liberty of humans to go beyond the constraints of the past into the future. He would die in the mid-50s. Forgive me for not remembering the dates. No historian, Brian. But that word, transhumanism, and along with the ideas of the noosphere and the omega point, would continue on after him. His friend, his close friend, Julian Huxley, brother of Aldous Huxley, grandson of T.H. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, would invoke transhumanism in a lecture in 1956. It would then be published in 1957. And for Huxley, as opposed to the spiritual, numinous ideas of Teilhard de Chardin, for Huxley it was purely scientific. And for him, transhumanism is the link from present-day humanity to the next evolution, the next step of evolution for the human race. And it was eugenic in its nature, both cultural eugenics and biological eugenics. He said that the transhuman man of the future would be as different from us as we are from Peking man, which is a caveman. And that this would be accomplished by way of scientific enlightenment and also cultural and social engineering. And you can see spread out among the rest of the corpus of his work, biological engineering, eugenics, more and more intelligent breeds of human beings that are preferred in the mating process over others, and leading to some sort of hyper-intelligent new human, a transhuman being. His brother Aldous Huxley, if you're familiar with his work, had a very critical slant on this. Conspiracy theorists will tell you he was running cover. He was controlled opposition. If that's the case, it's pretty astounding that whatever dark forces are behind this cabal, that they were able to draw out the genius of Aldous Huxley despite his supposed controlled opposition. But I just encourage you, if you explore these works, that to see that real tension and that real disgust that Aldous Huxley felt towards the hubris of his fellows and his brother. this transhuman idea would kind of lay dormant. Not the term would lay dormant. The idea really has been with us for centuries. And it would continue on through the 60s. It would continue on with the techno-enthusiasm and the belief that humanity through our creations was ultimately, despite all the darkness, despite Hiroshima and Nagasaki, despite the horrific sorts of wars and conquests, that ultimately what we're doing is positive. But it would be crystallized again with Max More, who I brought up earlier. Max More says that he had arrived at the term transhumanism before being aware of Julian Huxley's coinage, but is still in the same spirit. But by that point, in the late 80s, early 90s, you now had this technological element that is really in your face. So that the method is not just science and selective breeding. The method is active intervention technologically in the stream of evolution with human beings. And I would say that despite my extreme disagreement with Max More's point of view, I don't think that he is part of some sort of dark cabal, other than the fact that his pals, by and large, are going to think something like him. He is simply acting out from the extreme pole of the scientific materialist perspective, acting out the only role left to human beings, which is advancement, technological, scientific advancement, and the total transformation of the human being. Moore has been somewhat reticent on the topic of eugenics, but in regard to human augmentation, he is a complete proponent. In regard to cyborgization, the integration of human beings with technology, he is very much a proponent. Interestingly enough, very much an opponent of the vaccine and vaccine mandates that we've seen in the last 4 years. And so I say that just to highlight that he's very selective. He's looking for the most intelligent path forward, but it's a path that ultimately he sees as one, he's even compared it openly in his more incendiary writings with a kind of Luciferian impulse, the rebellious impulse in which human beings are rebelling not against a metaphysical God, but from the vicissitudes and the injustice of nature herself. And this quest, while Max More may seem like a fringe figure, and in a sense he is, he was very much a cult hero, especially for the techno-optimists. And again, the reason we use the word transhumanism is because of him. He's still somewhat fringe, but this point of view has become, I would say, the dominant point of view among the elites of our society. The wealthiest men on earth, from Sam Altman to Jeff Bezos to Bill Gates, Elon Musk being the wealthiest among them, and Larry Page, Sergey Brin of Google, all of them hold this view, some version of this view, that humankind can improve itself by way of technology, by radically altering the nature of humanity. And in addition to this, you have this idea of artificial intelligence, of artificial minds, an alien mind that could either facilitate that or perhaps replace human beings entirely. Now that idea is old as well. Quite interestingly, in the wake of World War II, you had in 1953 the publication of the paper by Francis Crick and James Watson detailing the structure of DNA, which would then allow for the kinds of genetic experimentation that is commonplace today in biolabs across the world. And 3 years later, in 1956, at Dartmouth, at a conference on computation, you would have the coinage of the term artificial intelligence by John McCarthy. So these are very old ideas, and they even harken back before Alan Turing. And Alan Turing's idea, right, the computer scientist and cryptographer Alan Turing, the idea that artificial intelligence would not just simply be a way of augmenting human intelligence, but would be an entity in and of itself and would surpass human abilities and would most likely replace human beings. This is an old idea, decades old. But it now seems to be coming into fruition, spearheaded by the most powerful corporations on earth, the tech corporations, facilitated and in partnership with the military of the most powerful government on earth, the United States, and the militaries of our adversaries. And this is the dominant idea of our age. It is the frontier. And in all of this, we're talking about alien minds, alien intelligences. It's a theme that I think that if you look at the history of the United States and this development of this petri dish, this cyborg vivarium, that you will consistently see an obsession with alien minds. When we think of aliens, we think about outer space. We think of these intelligences from outer space, superior intelligences that are either here to manipulate us or are here to harvest us or are here to help us, or maybe all of it. But that's a very, very old idea. If you look at the history of religions, you're talking about alien. What is alien? Alien is foreign. It's something that's from somewhere far, far away. And so if you look at the history of religion, what is being described? But these alien intelligences, these foreign, these non-human intelligences visiting Earth. Ezekiel has been pointed to many times as being a kind of UFO, but I think that even beyond that, there's still this notion that the human is limited and is reliant upon these external alien intelligences. And on a more mundane level, again, alien, foreign, the whole quest for social and spiritual and cultural diversity is an obsession with alien minds. Somehow the alien mind will save us. The Hindu will offer what the Christian does not. The African will offer what the European does not. And then in the case of artificial intelligence, it is the creation, quite literally, of an alien mind from nothing but silicon and electricity and data. It's oftentimes called in Silicon Valley and in those circles, the creation of higher digital intelligence is referred to as creating sand gods, causing sand to think. And it all is intermixed, right? If you look at the alien minds of the internal, whether it be conversations with gods or demons or spirits, if you look at the alien minds in terms of the visions of extraterrestrial species, which, by the way, while the American continent was being colonized in its very early phase, in Europe, again, as much as I'm averse to referring to them at all, especially after they lost my luggage. You had Johann Kepler in his story, The Dream, talking about visitations to the moon. In that same year, you had other, I forget the author, but it's basically a kind of satire of life on the moon in the 1600s. And this would just develop, the science, this idea that there's life out there would develop alongside. And then the cultural, and then the digital, so on and so forth. But these are ultimately the works of men, ambitious men, bold men, either operating in a physical environment in which they're constantly under challenge, or in a commercial environment where their company could go under any day if they make the wrong decision, or in a purely digital environment in which the creation of something is going to lead your company or your group, your in-group, to be the dominant force on earth. This is a very masculine quest. All of it, with some exceptions. And you have to wonder then, us as men, but men perhaps not of the means of the most economically or politically powerful, the elite, how do we respond to such a world? Now, I just want to map out two other elements of this, right? Because it's not, I don't want you to think that this is in any way abnormal. It's just simply not discussed as much as it should be. Much more so now, this year, than it was last, and surely to be discussed much more so in the near future. But I think one of the real heralds of the age that we're now entering into was the declaration of the Fourth Industrial Revolution by Klaus Schwab founder and then chairman of the World Economic Forum, who has now been canceled, which is pretty wild. But in 2016, 2015, he first published the book, and then in a larger press, 2016, the book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution. And the idea is very, very simple. Kind of retracing where we just came from, the mechanical revolution, steam engines, railroads, all of this, leading to the electrical revolution, light bulbs, telephones, all of this, leading to the digital revolution, computers, smartphones, all of this, leading to the fourth industrial revolution, which he saw as a kind of culmination of all these. And he defined it as the fusion of our physical, our digital, and our biological identities, or the convergence of the physical, digital, and biological worlds, a cyborg existence in which human beings are enmeshed with technology in irrevocable ways. And it was descriptive and prescriptive. Klaus Schwab's not developing any of these systems. He may be funneling money here and there and may be giving platforms to the people who make it, but he is observing this, but he's also offering prescriptions, mostly kind of globalist, quasi-socialist, public-private partnership sorts of ideas. But the very declaration of the Fourth Industrial Revolution for the kind of global left, from a prestigious organization, tells you that we are at an inflection point. But all this, of course, is coming not from the World Economic Forum, as much as you might hear people whom I will not name, blaming them for all of this. They're simply an apparatus riding over top. This is all coming out of American innovation. Much of what we call Silicon Valley, even though it's dispersed across the U.S. and across the world, but centered in the U.S. and centered in Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley, from its very early years, had this obsession with what we would call transhumanism, or what the Russians would call cosmism. There was actually a meeting in the 90s of the kind of transhumanist American and the Russian cosmists. The Russian cosmists come from, kind of like with Teilhard de Chardin, this guy, Fyodor Fedorov, if I'm remembering that correctly and pronouncing it correctly, a Russian Orthodox monk who had very heretical ideas of what the resurrection meant and what humanity was, but he saw humanity as basically kind of creating a heaven on earth. He saw a future in which the human records of a person's life could be reconstructed to resurrect a human being with technological advancements. And of course, cosmos, he saw all of this pushing out into space, which was also what Teilhard de Chardin saw with the omega point. The omega point is pushing humanity out into space. And so this sits at the heart of the Silicon Valley ethos and the creation of these sand gods and the creation of cyborgs and the alteration of the human genome for ever more superior or eugenic entities to operate within this cyborg vivarium that is interconnected by the technologies ruled over by billionaires, oligarchs, skinny weirdos who could kill you with the push of a button. And that space obsession, you see it with, say, Jeff Bezos with the cock rockets going into space, the Blue Origin phallus, most recently inhabited by a coven of witches. And Elon Musk is definitely right now at the top of that game. Elon Musk, for all his faults, sort of satanic imagery, hubris, insulting normal people, being autistic, he's a pimp. Ain't no two ways about it. I'll leave it to my colleague, employer Steve Bannon, to say all the nastiest things about him, but let's just say he is a pimp. And Elon Musk, I think more than any of the other oligarchs, even if he is a response to them, embodies that transhuman impulse to alter and perfect humanity and push us into the beyond, push us through that next frontier, or at least push a certain number of us through, while the rest of us sit with our VR goggles like, oh, this is great, we're in space now. And you look at his projects, beginning with SpaceX, advanced rocketry, some of the best rockets on Earth. And the weird prediction, perhaps you're familiar, that Wernher von Braun, who was brought to the United States, the Nazi who was brought to the United States through Operation Paperclip to help create the rockets in the early days of NASA, before NASA even, in the 50s. Wernher von Braun wrote a work of fiction in which he described a quest to colonize Mars. And the leader was Elon. Now, it wasn't the name of a person. Elon was like the rank. It was quite interesting, quite a weird coincidence. And of course, Musk has, as with all of his projects, a grand idea of what it would mean to go to Mars. He's not just going to Mars just to go and explore. He's going to Mars because he believes, as most materialist scientists do, that humanity is in a precarious situation with no God there to help us with anything. And so in order for humanity to ensure its survival, or at least up the probability of survival, we need to be multiplanetary. We need to have a presence beyond our Earth in case the asteroid hits. And that philosophical underpinning can be seen in all of his subsequent projects, so that the purchasing of Twitter, for instance, was to have under his control what he calls a cybernetic superintelligence, a superorganism, a cyborg vivarium, brains used to train AI, XAI, Grok, which comes from Robert Heinlein, who was a devotee of Aleister Crowley, just by coincidence. And XAI is an attempt at a truth-seeking, a maximally truth-seeking alien mind, a superintelligence. First, an artificial general intelligence that is smarter than any individual human being on Earth, evolving into, they believe, through self-improvement, an artificial superintelligence which is smarter than every human being on Earth, what we would normally call a god. Maybe the god if there's only one of them. And it is a big problem, right? Like Musk has been one of the first of the oligarchs to openly discuss this, based on other people's work, that superintelligence would be an existential threat to human beings if, in its freedom, in its liberty, it decided that human beings weren't worth keeping around. So what do? Aside from invading the entire world with robot immigrants from the Platonic realm, which Musk is now working on, with Optimus, which he believes will be 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 robot to human in the near future. Sort of like, again, it's like, you can say it's like Platonic Mexicans who come to do all the work and maybe even start to vote, who knows. But the other solution, Neuralink, is to allow human beings to augment themselves and keep up in an environment that is dominated by artificial minds, alien minds, non-human intelligences, gods, to become gods and increase human intelligence. And he believes, at least he says, that the best path forward for human beings is if hundreds of millions or billions of human beings have a Neuralink to create a collective hive mind to compete with the godlike artificial superintelligence. This is his vision. And below that, you have the Tesla bugmobiles, the autonomous vehicles that are the antithesis to everything that American fetishization of technological freedom really represents. The joyride is no more. You're just simply sitting there with your brain trodes taking the ride. A very good metaphor, really, for the technological system they're creating for us overall. One in which it is entirely controlled by external forces, and you are a mere passenger on this ride. And last but not least, I think Musk's probably the one closest to his heart, assuming he has one, is the baby mama project. He has many baby mamas, as you well know, and these baby mamas, at least a good portion of them, give birth in unnatural ways, one might say. And I don't like to focus on people's personal lives, but I do think that to the extent he's setting himself up as a role model, we should at least discuss what kind of model we're talking about. One in which he purchases women's access to women's ovaries, and many of them give birth through surrogates. And even though it's not been discussed openly, kind of gleaning it from the comments from Grimes and just assuming that the norm of prenatal or pre-implantation genetic testing is being used, what's probably happening, and this is my speculation, but I think it's a pretty reasonable one, is that the now normal practice of coaxing a woman to produce, say, 10 to 15 ova, and then inseminating each one of them in little, I guess, with pipettes and in little test tubes or whatever, and then allowing them to grow a bit, and then scraping them, and then testing for genetic supremacy, and then implanting the eugenically superior baby. That's probably what's going on with the Baby Mama Project, if I had to venture a guess. And so Musk represents, I think, more than any of these tech oligarchs, a few principles that we've been going over. The principle of liberty, not necessarily our liberty, but his. And maybe not even his liberty, but the liberty of the machines, the cyborg fusion, the liberty of this new humanity, of the transhuman, to come into being. And he represents America in its later phase because he's an immigrant and he's running around influencing our politics in ways that are quite amazing. That's pretty American. There's nothing more American these days than foreign money and foreign powers influencing your government. But maybe more than anything, Musk, even if he is not exactly a tough guy, he represents a new kind of masculinity. It's a dominating masculinity. And it's one that should alarm anyone. It's an imperial masculinity. And that's very respectable when you're reading history books about Augustus Caesar or whatever. But it's not when they're ruling over your society. And so if I'm going to leave you with anything, it's this. As we face this new cyborgized, ultra-diverse, multiculti, multiracial, polysexual, demisexual even, culture, you're going to have to figure out a few different things. I'm trying, but I'm hoping one of you will figure it out and just tell me what to do. You're going to have to figure out a few different things. One, how much of this diversity is worthwhile? Because some of it absolutely is. What can you take from this insane bio-digital chaos that we've been handed and take it and make it of value to push forward your own quest, your own hero's quest, so to speak? And in order to do that, you're going to have to draw certain lines. Everybody's going to have their own lines, but it's more powerful if we can collectively agree that certain lines are not to be crossed. And I won't go through the list, not just for the constraint of time, but also because I think that it would be so diverse in this room. Perhaps at dinner tonight we can go through some of that. But you have to figure out where the lines are, and wherever your lines are, you have to put up a cultural barrier and say, this will not invade my world. But the most important thing to me is not going to be the negation of those things that are either morally or aesthetically reprehensible or undesirable. The most important thing will be where you anchor your soul, where you anchor your consciousness, your mind, your psyche, your spirit. Where is that anchor? And again, given the vast diversity of religious traditions that one can attach oneself to, this is also going to be very personalized and individual, but the most powerful will be the collective. And if I could sum it up, just to go back to an earlier concept, if I could sum it up in any way, at the very least, religion, what's the root of religion? To bind yourself to something, right? Bind yourself to a God, but also to bind yourself to an ethic, an ethos. You have the range from the golden rule to the black. And so either in your day-to-day life and with your fellows, you can choose to do unto others as you would have others do unto you, to empathize enough and maybe even be stern enough to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or the more hands-off silver rule approach of not doing unto others as they would do unto you, or the manipulative bronze rule of doing unto others as you would have them, or in order for them to do unto you, or the more badass but primitive and somewhat ghetto-ish ethos of the iron rule of the Hell's Angels. Be good to me, or treat me good and I'll treat you better. Treat me bad and I'll treat you worse. Or the black rule, so common in our culture, of Aleister Crowley, the black rule. The black rule, do what thou wilt. Or maybe the silicon rule, chip others as you would be chipped. But these are going to be your choices. This is the palette. And I don't think any of us are going to stick with any one. I think if we're honest, we all kind of range across them. But if I could urge you one thing, and mainly because I know the room I'm speaking to, it's to draw as close as you can to Christ, to embrace the golden rule, but hopefully do so in a way that is not as intolerant and oppressive so as to ruin what we have gained in America, which is in fact our liberty. But it's my hope we will use that liberty to do good and not to do evil. And with that, I appreciate your attention. Thank you very much. I'm now your subject.